second monthly seminar series, Ethics Seminar Series. Our speaker is Steve Ansolabehere, who's a professor of government at Harvard. He's an expert in public opinion and elections and has published extensively on elections, mass media, and representation. He's a there's a long list of things that Steve is. He's a Carnegie Scholar, a Hoover National Fellow, a Truman Scholar, and was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2007. He directed the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project from 2000 to 2004. And among his many jobs, in addition to being on the faculty at Harvard, is he consults for CBS News election decision desk. So if you are ever upset about a race that's called in a particular way, you can blame Steve. And he's the principal investigator of the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, a collaborative effort of over 60 universities and colleges in the U.S. He's published 5 books, and I think he is the leading energy political scientist in the world, and we're lucky to have him here today. So welcome, Steve.
I'm actually going to talk to you about book number 5, which is just out from MIT Press, called Cheap and Clean: How Americans Think About Energy in the Age of Global Warming. Just a little bit of background. In 2001, I was eyes deep in voting technology. We'd just come through the 2000 election, and David Baltimore, who's the president, at that time was the president of Caltech, and Chuck Vest, who was the president of MIT, had this brilliant idea that we shouldn't be voting on punch cards because we didn't do anything else on punch cards at that time. It was outmoded technology. Why were you using this old technology? And they did a very MIT Caltech thing, which is they pulled together the social scientists and the engineers to solve a problem. Surely we can do better than this. A big press conference, big press release. All the money was there before we walked in the room. It was great. It's like the way you want to do research. You didn't have to do any work, except for the work. And in 2001, I was really eyes deep in this. We were writing reports. We were trying to get ready for what was obviously going to be federal legislation on this matter. And I got a call from Paul Joskow, who's an economist, and Richard Lester, who's a nuclear scientist, said, we have a problem and we'd like to talk to you about it, which is that we're involved in this study of nuclear power, and we've been told that we need some help. And these are the real principles behind the nuclear study, which is the first of the MIT energy studies. John Deutsch, ex-director of the CIA, and Ernie Moniz, who's currently the Secretary of Energy, were pulling together a team of social scientists and engineers and scientists to try to deal with the question of what to do about nuclear power in the United States. And the question that they had posed, or the goal that they had in mind, was that the U.S., in order to deal in a serious way with global warming, had to build 300 new nuclear power plants by 2050. There are about 100 nuclear power plants in the U.S. at that time. It's still about that number. So if we just think about all the political fights from the 1970s and 80s and the state of the industry from the 1980s on, this did not seem like a smart thing to do. It seemed like they were just itching for a fight, which, given John's personality, is not unlikely. So they hired us to do a survey to take a look at what the public thought about global warming and what the public thought about nuclear power. And their motivation was, given global warming, what should we do about nuclear power? It was not a question about an energy shortage or energy crisis or rising prices or even waste disposal, though that's certainly what they were going to have to deal with. It was a question about this looming problem and what it meant for the restructuring of the energy industry in the United States and perhaps around the world. And the show-stopping result that we got was that concern about global warming was uncorrelated, or actually negatively correlated, with willingness to build new nuclear power plants in the United States. People who were concerned about global warming, which was the premise behind their report, did not want the technology that they were going to put forward. And for the engineers, this was a showstopper. Like, oh my God, like the door we think we're pushing on is actually a closed door. In fact, a locked door, bolted shut multiple times over. But that didn't stop us from doing what we thought was a thorough study and taking this as an opportunity to think about not just nuclear power, but the entire energy sector and how nuclear power fit into it. And that prompted a series of energy studies, The Future of Nuclear Power, The Future of Coal, The Future of Natural Gas, a nice book on energy innovation by Richard Lester and David Hart, Future of Solar Power, a study that doesn't seem to want to come together very easily, Revisiting the Future of Nuclear Power, and so forth. And behind what my contribution as a political scientist to this enterprise was helping the engineers think about what people want and why. And one of the experiences I had, just as a personal experience, was working with engineers on public opinion was forcing them to get out of their world, to think about where they were in the world. And on the coal study, we were particularly interested in a technology called carbon capture and sequestration. And the technologist who was leading that piece of it was very keen to know what Americans thought of carbon capture and sequestration. How many of you know what carbon capture and sequestration is? Right? So you are not typical. I've never had an actual zero on a survey before. But when we asked, what is carbon capture and sequestration? Or actually, we asked, which of these technologies reduces carbon emissions and which of them helps to reduce carbon in the atmosphere? And 0 people said that they knew anything about this technology in the United States. Right? So, and for the technologist, seeing that was an eye-opener, because Howard's response was, no one in America knows what I'm working on. But it's also an opportunity for him to start to think about what he's working on, how it will be received, and where that might lead. And that's really what the question behind our research has been. Why study the politics of energy? We are not in an energy crisis in the United States. We are the envy of the world in terms of energy resources. Coal, oil, natural gas, uranium, go down the list. And we have abundance where every other country seems to have limitations. The problem is global warming. Even pollution is not the problem that other countries face. It's a huge problem for humanity that is foreseeable and possibly preventable, which makes it a fascinating public policy problem to work on, and a depressing one at the same time. It's an externality and collective action problem. It is a global problem, a truly global problem. And energy is the single largest contributor to it. So that's the real motivation for really focusing on energy today. What is the problem we're trying to solve? The other reason is that there are massive changes in the American electricity sector coming. There is the growing obsolescence of power plants. There's increasing demand for power. There's new technology. And one of the most remarkable things about over time trends in energy use in the United States is that the U.S. has gotten much more efficient. We're simply doing more with less. We're producing more gross domestic product per BTU consumed over the very long time trend. But consumption changes are not going to be enough to really bend our consumption curve. And for me as a political scientist, massive changes in any sector, especially the energy sector, are going to be hugely political, from the local level all the way up to the national level, from the siting of a nuclear power plant or the decommissioning of a coal plant all the way up to passage of an Energy Act. So it provides ample opportunity for us to think about really profound, basic political problems. And that's what this project is about. What started in 2001 became a 12-year project. One never knows where something's going to end once it starts, and one thing led to the next. It's very much the story of this particular project. The first step in that project was actually to look at what was known about public attitudes about energy in the United States at that time. And it turned out that even though we've been through a big energy crisis and so forth, there was almost no systematic public opinion about energy. There was, the Cambridge Energy Research Associates had a nice time series of questions about whether we should build more nuclear power plants, and that built on a Gallup series. So we could go back to about 1968 and see, like, kind of monthly where the American public was. But survey researchers got bored with that question because it wasn't moving. After 3 Mile Island, it would drop below 50%. When you have the majority in favor of something and it doesn't move, probably not worth asking too much more about. And around 2000, people actually stopped asking about the question altogether. Nothing was known about public attitudes about coal, about natural gas, a little bit about oil. The main thing that we learned about oil from surveying the existing literature was people blamed U.S. oil companies for the gas shortages in the 1970s, not OPEC. They didn't even know what OPEC really was. This was, maybe indirectly that was the case. The U.S. oil companies were instrumental in developing a lot of the technology infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and other countries. But I don't think that's really what people thought. So our goal really was to, when we started this, to try to establish a baseline. What do people think about energy? How do they compare coal and nuclear, natural gas, and wind and solar? What's the picture in the American public's mind about what they want and why they want it? We wanted to compare all energy sources. There was no comparative research. There was always nuclear power in the abstract, as opposed to nuclear power compared to coal, which is really the competitor. Coal at that time was a little over 50% of electricity production. So not understanding coal was an enormous hole in our understanding. Why do people think the way that they do? Why are people in support of one energy source and not another? Is this a political issue? Is it a regional issue? And so forth. And we distinguished several models. Just thought of like, how could people be thinking about this? Is it party and ideology, typical political variables? The advisory committee to the MIT nuclear study thought this was going to be a highly politically charged issue. Democrats were going to be on one side, Republicans on another side, and so forth. Turns out energy is not political in terms of national partisan politics, at least, or ideological, really at all. One of the least political subjects I've ever encountered. What about consumers? So my economics friends would say, let's start thinking about consumers. And a lot of the discussions in the MIT energy project, especially the nuclear project, were about, what's the base load price going to be? How much are we going to have to charge for this and that? What's the projected cost of natural gas? Is natural gas going to drive nuclear out, or is the then projected rising natural gas price going to create an opportunity for nuclear power, which was, I think, the assumption of that study. What about a policy model? When I talked to most of my economics friends who are not in that room, they think about there being an optimal social policy, and if we can just find that optimal social policy, the public will go for it, because they'll realize what the right thing to do is. That is not the way the public thinks. Is there a psychological model? Coming out of the 1970s, there's interesting work done by a psychologist named Paul Slovic, who was one of the important cognitive researchers in the 70s and beyond. And he had this idea that what colored our thinking about nuclear power was dread. The image that people have in their heads is a mushroom cloud, or a radioactive waste image. So for them, our sense of dread or comfort was the way people thought. So what's right? How do I understand this? And what I want to lean on today is what we're going to do is dig in to this field and see where our understanding of how people think about energy points us to maybe a solution to how we think about, talk about, and pursue policies about global warming and climate change. I must say that this was a long journey, 12 years, and there were some big emotional ups and downs. I started out thinking, this is cool, this is exciting, new research, lots of cool people to work with. I love working with my colleagues and meeting them and working intensely with them and really getting to know them. And a lot of these people became good friends from these different studies, but also by the middle of the decade, I felt that there was no out. We were in serious trouble, and I've kind of come to a different view. Actually, thanks in part to my talk, who out of the blue sent me a paper that he thought I should read, and it changed a set of questions we started asking around 2008, and really opened up, I think, an interesting way to think about what we're doing. I'll tell you what that way to think about what we're doing is, which is we should forget about climate change for the time being. So what are the basic questions that drive the survey? Questions about preference about energy sources. What do you want the U.S. energy sector to look like? Think about that for a second. What do you want the U.S. energy sector to be like? Maybe you want an all-nuclear sector or largely nuclear sector? 300 nuclear power plants, given demand projections, would have just kept us at 20% nuclear. So this is going to be a shrinking nuclear sector. How expensive do you think energy is from different sources? What do you think the most expensive form of energy is for providing most of your baseload electricity? If you went to like primarily this is my main source, what would it be? What would be the cheapest? Those are probably the ways in which we think that people, the lenses that people are viewing things, but also how harmful would it be to have lots of coal power plants everywhere, lots of nuclear power plants, or big solar farms? What would be good for the environment, bad for the environment? Global warming. How much does global warming motivate your thinking? We started asking the Gallup question, which is, how concerned are you about global warming? And then we switched in 2003 to asking something really concrete, which is, how much more on your electricity bill would you be willing to pay if it reduced global warming emissions by whatever percent, 30%, 20%, and so forth. And we took that on the road. We asked that survey in a lot of different countries now. And it's a depressingly small number, about $5 more a month, which is about 5% more on your electricity bill. And it's the same in the US, same in Sweden, same in Germany, same in France, same in Japan, same in Canada, etc. People are not willing to really put their dollars, even people who say they're concerned about global warming, not willing to put their dollars where their hearts are. Some key findings before we go digging, because you might want to tune out a lot of digging. It's usually what happens. So Americans want to move away from coal and oil, and they always have. They want to move to solar and wind. They love solar and wind. Hugely popular, right? Overwhelmingly popular. Why? Mainly because of environmental harms, concerns about local air pollution, water pollution, toxic waste. It's not global warming, local harms are what motivates them, as well as costs. And age isn't a factor, party's not a factor really. There's a little bit that shows up. Education, region, religion. These are the usual things that explain attitudes. They're not really doing much work here. It's people's perceptions of the costs and the harms, which sounds more like people are behaving as consumers. They're thinking about this like they're consumers, trying to find something with good qualities, good attributes. Are some fuels different from others? Is nuclear really poisonous in the public's mind? The answer is a little bit. A little bit, but in fact, the weight, the preference structure, the weight that costs and harms have, and we'll see this, is about the same for all fuels. And how people are differentiating is they think that something's less harmful or more harmful, or cheaper or more expensive, and that's the way they're thinking about it. But how much harm matters to them is about the same for nuclear, about the same for coal, about the same for oil, etc. How much prices matter for them is about the same for oil, coal. Yeah.
Just ask, when you talk about economic costs, are you talking about what their perceptions of the costs are, as opposed to their understanding of the costs?
Exactly. And you'll see we do some experiments because that's where the perceptual flaws are. Okay. Global warming. How much does global warming really drive people's attitudes? Global warming concern, like how concerned are you in the abstract, seems like it is increasingly correlated. In the beginning of the decade, it was completely uncorrelated with your preference about energy use. It's increasingly important. So people are starting to think about this. However, willingness to pay is uncorrelated with energy preferences, which is more of a concern, because that's where the real action is. It's when we start talking about policy, we're going to start talking about carbon taxes and cap and trade systems, and that's the price that people are going to be willing to pay. And if people aren't willing to pay more, they may not be willing to switch to the more expensive or the cheaper energy source. And finally, come back to this problem of what drives public policy about global warming. How much does public preferences, what parts of public preferences matter? How are people thinking about global warming policy? Is it completely divorced from energy? Or is it related to energy? And we'll see that it's related to energy in an important way. So what do people want?
Steve, you passed over your point about inefficient policies on the previous slide.
people want what most economists consider the least efficient policy. Sorry.
What does that mean?
Carbon taxes and cap and trade are not nearly as popular as letting the EPA set caps and regulate stuff straight up.
And how do things like renewable portfolio standards
Renewable portfolio standards, subsidies, so forth, end up in that first category of regulation. So the inefficient policies tend to show up a lot. And we see that a lot in state initiatives where a lot of state policies get adopted that are energy policies. It's a bit of a puzzle and concern as to why the public seems to prefer the least efficient. And we could argue about what really is going on. But the answer is it's sort of an interesting missing component to the discourse about carbon taxes and cap and trade. That the discourse about carbon taxes and cap and trade in particular has been divorced from energy discussions. The one person who really capitalized on that was Tom Steyer in the defense of California's cap and trade system. It was taxed, it was an attempt to repeal it in an initiative. Talk about that in a minute, but more than a minute, but several minutes. Steyer came out and defended it kind of brilliantly. He didn't talk about cap and trade at all. He didn't talk about global warming at all in the campaign. It was all about the evils of the Texas oil companies who are coming into California and about smog. The law had nothing to do with smog. So what do people want? Here's the basic question we started with in 2002. There's a little wordy following like some protocols that other people had helped us develop. Get the person in. Consumers such as you have more and more say about stuff. So what do you think? To make electricity, future electricity demands over the next 25 years, should we build more or less of each of these? Over time, we simplified the question and discovered that we don't need all those words, which is a good thing. The alternative got reduced to this, like, in order to meet future energy needs, do you favor increasing or decreasing each of the following? Coal, oil, nuclear, etc. And there's just in a grid on the internet. Click, look at one. Very nice way to ask. And what we find, I'll hop up here and point. What we find is green represents more, and red represents less. Natural gas, coal, oil, nuclear power, solar, wind. And these are the different surveys we've done from 2002 to 2013 throughout the time trends. Notice a few things. Preferences are really stable. There's not a lot of, there's some shifting up and down. Gas goes up as prices fall, becomes much more popular. But the traditional fuels are pretty unpopular. And the alternative fuels are very popular. This is a really important fact to understand about what people want. Just keep that in mind. That's going to be mainly what we're going to think about. What is it that people want?
Why do you say they're ready to embrace? That seems like a permanent feature.
Because this has increased a lot. They're ready. And we don't have a lot of it.
But it didn't increase. It's flat, right, from 2002 to 2013.
This is increase a lot. The percentage of people wanting to increase it a lot, and it's about 80%.
The question itself.
Yeah, 80% of people are willing to increase solar power a lot.
But I'm saying that's been constant over time.
Right, they're ready for it. It doesn't exist in any meaningful way. Wind doesn't exist in any meaningful way in the U.S. electricity sector, but Americans, 80% are ready to increase it a lot. Add another 10% to that, and you've got 90+% are ready to increase wind, increase solar.
But I guess here's what I'm trying to ask. What do you want me to, how am I supposed to think about that? Because the price, I have a very narrow economics perception of the world, and the price of solar has changed dramatically over that period.
Come back to price.
All right.
It's not what you think, and it's not what reality is. It's what every survey respondent in the United States has in their head.
Because I probably have felt the same way about rainbows since 2002.
I think there should be more rainbows, and maybe ponies as well. Thank you for reminding me. But the basic picture is that people want more wind and solar, and they want less coal, nuclear, and oil. And gas is kind of in between. So it's tweener fuel, and it's become more popular over the last decade. Opinions are fairly stable, as Michael pointed out. Like these numbers aren't changing a lot. And one might think that maybe they should be changing more depending on price fluctuations. We do see some areas where gas, such as gas, where there is a lot of change. Another interesting fact is that when you add all those together, individual by individual, there are very few people you'd consider conservationists, as in use less electricity no matter what, okay, regardless of source. In fact, conservationists are really pro-wind and pro-solar only people. So maybe they're really just environmentalists, hardline environmentalists, rather than true conservationists in the sense of using less, conserving the consumption of electricity. There are also very few people who say all of the above. And this is an interesting note because, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, the Obama administration thought that was the smart thing to campaign on in 2012, and they pushed this all of the above idea. It might have been kind of good to like placate West Virginia coal miners, but in fact, it wasn't reaching a lot of people. Not a lot of people who want all of the above in the energy sector. The West Virginia coal people probably didn't want a lot of North Dakota natural gas out there. Deeper question, though, is why do they want it? Why do people love solar and hate coal? Or hate oil? You probably know the answer in your head because you're American. That's basically, what do you think the answer is?
It's new.
It's new.
Limitless.
It's limitless. It's clean.
It's clean.
So the way we approached this was we started to ask about alternatives. What are the attributes of the alternative energy sources? What are their costs? What are their harms? And there are other things down, politics, risk, what the optimal policy is, and so forth. And the question was, for harms, some ways of generating electricity are harmful to the environment. They produce air pollution, water pollution, toxic wastes. How harmful do you think each of the following are? Costs, how expensive do you think electricity from each of the following sources is? There are various versions of these we asked, and the question order didn't matter so much. And here's a comparison for each of several years. The years are in different colors. For coal, where 3 is moderately costly, and this is very inexpensive, and this is very expensive. And people think that coal is pretty moderately costly. Natural gas is a little on the inexpensive side compared to coal. Oil is less expensive. Nuclear, hydro, solar. I'm sorry. This is very cheap. Sorry, this is very expensive. This is very cheap. So they think that coal is less expensive than natural gas until the end of the decade. Oil is more expensive than natural gas. Nuclear is more expensive than natural gas. Hydro, solar, and wind are cheap. This is a really interesting point because one of the things that many of my engineering friends wanted to do is run public education campaigns where we educate people about energy. If you educated people about energy, they would learn where they're wrong because this number ought to be way down here. Yeah.
Tell us what you mean by cost here. Does that include the externalities?
No, it's like price. What you pay. Yeah, what you pay. What you pay as a consumer.
As a consumer.
Yeah.
So it's anticipating what the price per BD will be.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that is?
Yes.
You think that's
Yeah.
right?
Think about your electricity bill. Immediately before that question, we actually asked them what their electricity bill is.
Okay.
So we really anchor it.
So the framing
Yeah.
will help you. I still doubt what you're saying, but the
Okay.
framing will help a lot. If that's what's in the line.
But people, and we've replicated this different ways, and you'll see an experiment where when we tell people the actual cost of providing electricity or some fictitious number, this moves a lot. Okay. So what's happening is people are wrong about this, and they adjust. In terms of harms, going back to our earlier conversation, people think of solar, wind, and hydro as relatively harmless. Coal, oil, and nuclear, pretty harmful. Natural gas somewhere in between. This is quite important because it turns out that when we seek to explain things, the harms are really quite important. When I showed these numbers to Paul Joskop, he's like, huh. Except for those prices of solar and wind, the American public, on average, not each person, but the American public on average has the picture about right in terms of harms and costs. People have the costs for traditional fuels about right. They're way too optimistic about solar and wind. And the caution is that if you inform them, you're going to get lower support. The question was then, how do those understandings of prices and costs and politics and all the rest translate into what you want the future to be, whether you want more or less of something? So our goal was to estimate how much weight prices have in your thinking, how much weight harms have in your thinking, how much weight global warming concerns have in your thinking about each of the fuel sources, how much weight poverty has, how much weight your regional area is, education and so forth. And we took two approaches. We took a kind of old-fashioned regression approach, and then we did some experiments embedded in surveys. And one of the things I like about doing the experiments embedded in surveys is they basically tell us the regressions are actually about right. I think that's more true than not. I think we lose faith in the old things sometimes a little too quickly. And the regression, for those of you who are interested, looks something like this. For each fuel, for each individual, I do a basic regression, linear regression, harms and costs, for various attempted interactions and so forth. And what I'd like to do is measure the weight, the regression coefficient on harm, and the regression coefficient on cost. And I'd like to compare for each fuel how the harms and costs compare. Harms more important, costs more important. I'd also like to see across fuels, do harms matter more for some fuels and less for others? Do costs matter more for some fuels and less for others? And I'd like to somehow come up with some estimate of what's the total effect of cost perceptions, what's the total effect of harm perceptions. And I'm throwing this up just so that the economists in the room know that I actually did some data analysis. So, it's like crank through lots of regressions to come up with lots of coefficients, and we can come back to this. But one of the things that shows up is that this is 2008 data. Willingness to pay to solve global warming has really negligible effects, and it shows up significant sometimes. Parties not very important, and so forth. Perceived harm is pretty big on all the fuels and bigger than perceived cost. And it turns out to be about the same across fuels.
Can you
go back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Could you reject that those coefficients are the same? I guess you can.
Which ones?
The harm ones and the perceived cost ones.
So natural gas harm seems to matter a little less for natural gas in this particular year. This one was a blip down. It's higher in other years. The coefficients are pretty similar across. And the cost coefficients are a bit lower. And standardizing doesn't alter that conclusion. So costs are mattering, but they're mattering a little less than harms. Harms are mattering the most. And when we look at if you thought about the variance across fuels and the harms and costs, there was more spread in harm perceptions than cost perceptions. So when we come back to evaluate how much harms matter versus how much costs matter, harms are going to matter a lot more because people see bigger differences across fuels and harm, and the weight of harm is bigger. So both things are going to make harms be the main driver of how people think about energy. And these are local environmental harms as opposed to global harms.
Could you take just a second to tell us who these 500 people are and how you found them?
Oh, sure. So we've done surveys on the phone, we've done surveys on the internet, and we decided that the internet was a cheaper, faster, more reliable way to go, believe it or not. And that seems to be where the entire industry is headed. These are internet surveys. This one was by Knowledge Networks, which their sampling framework is they do phone surveys and then entice people to do an internet survey on top of it. So it's probabilistic sampling. Some of the other surveys are by YouGov, which does internet recruitment, and then they have a kind of strategy for randomization. Turns out there's no difference between these two firms, even though the technologies for soliciting folks is pretty similar. The weighting turns out to be important. There is one thing that's worth noting, which is the intercept here is quite large here for nuclear power. That's indicating that people still don't like nuclear power. In separate analyses, we can get rid of that difference when we include concerns about waste storage and concerns about accidents. That's largely the missing explanation. When we ask the same question about accidents and waste associated with all the other energy sources, those questions aren't adding anything beyond the local environmental harm. So there's something about accidents and waste with nuclear power that is unique.
So if it's not harms or costs or global warming concern or any of these things that are explaining their willingness to increase our use of these fuels, what are we thinking?
Actually, this is harms are doing a lot of work.
Well, what I'm saying is that you're
The R squared to it though?
you're missing somewhere between over half and 85%
Yeah.
of what is actually determining their answer.
This is like labor economics. If we can get that wage regression above 30%, we're good.
I'm saying that there's something.
This is John Deutsch's first reaction as well. Like the first regression I produced for him had an R squared of 55%. He's a chemist. Like 55%. Like in my business, it's 99.5 or nothing. So it varies from field to field. And, this is pretty good.
Demographics or.
Yeah, when we start, so we control for age, education, income, gender, minority status, religion, region. So that's all in there. Other things.
I was trained as a labor economist, so Steve's question is completely unfair. Yeah, that's a great R squared.
There's something missing.
Yeah, there's a lot more to understand. The question is what, and we can get the R squared on nuclear up by throwing in waste and accidents, but that's like more things against nuclear because they don't have great answers to engineers for the waste problem still. So that's the.
That I think is another statement. Engineers have the answer. It's the politics that's the problem.
Yeah, if you can find me a good place to store it. And that might be political or it might be seismic, I don't know.
Swedes have a solution. I mean, that's a.
But we still don't have a permanent waste storage facility. And the one that they built isn't in great seismic location and stuff.
Well, that's Harry Reid, I think.
That's true. Not anymore.
Not even right.
So the regression estimates provide evidence for what we were calling a consumer model. That what is weighing more than all the political and psychological factors is consideration of prices and harms. That's really what seems to be, to the extent that we're getting the R squared up, that's what's accounting for most of the explained variation. People value the environment highly relative to the other factors. Local environmental concerns. Costs are important, but they're also a smaller effect. And people are thinking about the way all energy sources about the same way. And one interesting other fact, I just showed you 1 year of regressions, is that when we extract all those coefficients and compare them over time, the coefficients are pretty stable. There's a little bouncing up and down, not surprising. But what and how people think is remarkably stable over time. So perceived price, perceived cost, harm, and those weights are pretty stable. So it's not like people, if people were completely clueless, stuff would be like moving all over the place. There's something meaningful behind public attitudes. There's a question, however, about causality. So in this project, we ran a lot of survey experiments. So we would have a survey of, say, 2,000 people. We'd take 500. They were the control group. That's what you just saw, those 500 people. And then we'd take other subsets and provide them with information to see if we could move them around and if they moved in the right direction. So in 2002, we did an experiment. The control group got no information. There were 4 treatment groups. One got a price treatment. Here's the price of energy from each of these sources according to Deutsche Bank. One got a global warming treatment. It said global warming is this impending threat and it's going to cause coastal flooding and droughts and food shortages and all sorts of other things. This was 2002, so we're, Al Gore has not spoken yet. Well, he did, but not really. Another got a toxic waste treatment. They're toxic waste associated with fossil fuels, specifically about fossil fuels. another got a combined treatment of all of that information. And the information was provided immediately prior to asking about your preferences about the future. And what we found was a lot of movement. But the movement, interestingly enough, was when we told people about prices, the coal, natural gas, and nuclear power price preferences didn't shift. That meant people kind of had the right information in their heads. There wasn't any movement. And that's roughly what we had. Oil became more popular. People were overestimating the price of oil, or electricity for one. Hydro, solar, and wind dropped. People had the wrong price information and they adjusted. Dropped a lot, 40% drop in support for solar. Global warming concerns didn't do much, and if anything, they pushed solar, wind, and hydro in the wrong direction. Toxic waste concerns did a lot, especially made nuclear power more popular. And then finally, when we combined all those effects, what we saw was that nuclear became more popular, in part because nuclear sort of left out of, it was kind of the pivotal one, and then solar, wind, and hydro, coal, and gas became less popular.
So how can you distinguish between them already knowing the right price as opposed to
Huge.
them not caring?
Huge.
So if you were to break it out as a function
Right.
of, look, you knew if they...
So we took the DDA. So when I go back and I back out, I'm just going to show you a few more experiments, just to give you a flavor for like we used to do lots of these. We did another experiment with cost. One group had no information, another group was told different costs. And one group of cost information said that natural gas was relatively cheap, and another one said it's relatively expensive compared to nuclear. Nuclear is our one of our baseline groups, and what we're finding is when people learn the price of energy from hydro, solar, and wind goes down. When people see compared with those prices, the prices of oil, coal, natural gas, and nuclear, support goes up. And so people are calibrating and adjusting. And since these were actual dollar figures as opposed to generally expensive, we're able to calibrate exactly this concern about how much off were they. And it turned out it was like about the right percentage difference in your electricity bill. 2008, we did another cost experiment, this time with natural gas. That was nuclear. This is natural gas, sorry, got them backward. See the same pattern. Big drops, 70% drops, 60% drops in support for hydro. And people are really, for wind and solar, people are really adjusting. They've got the wrong price in their head. This is like very pessimistic if you believe in public education, because it means if we educate people about true prices, where will public opinion go? It will go toward gas, toward oil, toward coal, toward all the things Michael wants to get rid of. So why do harms matter more? Well, one possibility is that the average person cares more about the environment than electricity price. Maybe. People really get upset about the gas prices. They're really upset. In another part of my life, I've done a lot of surveying on what do people know, what facts do people know. Do they know the unemployment rate? Do they know the interest rate? Do they know the stock market price? Do they know the gas price? The number that they know the best is the gasoline price. It's within cents of their local gasoline price. Unemployment rates range from 0 to 100%. The Mode has got right that the average is somewhere around 25%. So people are like kind of guessing about what the unemployment rate is. The idea that somehow they're rationally updating on what the unemployment rate is, interest rate, not right. Could be also that harms matter more because that's what markets deliver price. And there's unmet demand for more environmental protection, and that what they're expressing through public opinion is where their unmet demand is. And finally, it could be transparency, which is people know where their electricity comes from, but they don't link the behavior to the harms. They don't quite see that connection. And that might be why they think that harms matter more, and that they can see the prices, but they can't see the harms. So how does this general picture that I've developed translate into a narrative about public policy. This is like what people want and why do they want it, and trying to deepen our understanding of that and getting into the details. And it was quite a ride to go into that. And there were many more experiments and many more surveys. It's just a flavor of it. But it gives you the general point, which is what people care a lot about is local environmental harms. It's really the thing that accounts for most of the explained variation. Then price. Some party a little bit, maybe on some of these fuels. Some ideology a little bit. The people on the far left are a little more pro-nuclear, pro-solar, and pro-wind, but not a big difference. Even in order to get 90%, that means a lot of Republicans like solar and wind more than coal. Okay? You can't have those numbers don't add up. So it's like everybody likes those fuel sources. It's not. That's why this is not partisan. So how does this narrative translate into policy about local harms mattering more? So around 2000, I guess it was the 2006 State of the Union address. Bush was starting to talk about global warming. I think it was 2006, and I was watching State of the Union address, which I don't usually do because I find it tedious. And I was sitting there thinking, and then he got right up to saying something about global warming, and then he's like veered off on some other tangent. I thought, he just missed a brilliant policy option. That he could have gotten his taxes, his tax bill, complete restructuring the tax code of the United States, cut corporate rates, cut high income rates, traded that with the Democrats and blamed the Democrats for a big increase in gas prices to give them their policy. And I thought, oh, that's what we should be doing. We should be doing that. So we started asking questions about, well, what if you traded this tax policy for that tax policy? Gas taxes for income tax. What if you trade gas taxes for deficit reduction? And so forth. We asked a lot of those questions. And what I got back was people were starting to think about carbon taxes not as environmental policy, but as tax policy. So all of a sudden it was partisan. It hadn't been partisan before. And all of a sudden it was just getting complicated. So I wanted to try to understand what we could do to move policy forward, because even these ideas about trading taxes and so forth seem to be making these policies that my colleagues in economics were pushing highly partisan, highly political, kind of things that they gridlock over. Congress was not functioning on tax policy then, still isn't. So how do we find a narrative from what we've learned that will help us think about where we should go with climate policy? What's acceptable? What's the political opening we have? This is about when I read that paper by Mike. And Assembly Bill 32, the bill passed in the California State Assembly, eventually made it into law. It created a cap and trade system aimed at carbon, not at sulfur dioxide or smog or anything else. And at this time, Waxman-Markey was also, AB 32 was a little before. Waxman-Markey was the 2009 climate legislation in Congress. Waxman-Markey was debated all about climate. This is climate, 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 climate. All you heard. It was not about energy. There's no real discussion about how this was going to change the energy sector until we got to the politics, and it was like, ugh, we're not going to get the Montana senator. Max Box is off. We're not going to get the West Virginia senators. They're off. Like, oh, we're dead because the coal states are not going to go for this. 2010, AB 32 was passed around the same time, 2008, 2009. And in 2010, one of the worst years for Democrats and environmentalists in recent history. You think about the 2010 election. And during the 2010 election, there was an attempt called Prop 23 in California to repeal AB 32. Get rid of this climate legislation. And the proponents of Prop 23 could go back and read the literature, the stuff that was posted and sent to every California voter, stressed that this was going to raise energy prices in the state of California. Your gas prices, your electricity prices were going to go up because of this. The opponents of Prop 23 made it all about smog. Actually, all the stuff's still online, so you can just go and Google it and find the voter pamphlet. And in big bold letters, it's like, Texas oil companies are coming to destroy California. And AB 32 is going to get rid of smog, which is becoming a bigger and bigger. Anybody from California? Anybody from the Central Valley?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Central Valley, like, there was no smog when I was a kid. Now it's choked. So people all over California are worried about smog. And Tom Steyer smartly made this about smog, which was not at all what the legislation was about. This wasn't going to do anything real for smog. But they made it into a local environmental harm concern. They didn't make it about climate. They read the public opinion and did the right choice. And the local environmental harms trumped cost concerns. And this was one of the few things that people had to cheer about after the 2010 election, because Prop 23 was beaten pretty soundly. It was one of the few times that the oil companies had been defeated in California on a big environmental initiative like this. So fighting against the stream, or swimming against the stream, they prevailed. And I think there lies the really big message about changing the way we're talking and thinking about climate, and changing the way we're talking and thinking about policy discussions, and focusing on local environmental harms associated with energy production, and focusing on energy production, not on climate. So I started just grabbing all the survey data I could find, some questions we'd asked, some questions other people had asked on policies. And what I found were there are 3 clusters of policies where there's extensive survey research since 2009, since the Energy Act debate. Regulating emissions, caps. That comes in lots of different forms: renewable portfolio standards, actual limits on carbon emissions, and they take the form of limiting a quantity in economics. Cap and trade, regulation with some sort of tradable permits that allows you to price the externalities that's more efficient than a cap. And carbon taxes, some sort of usage or production tax, or different ways in which carbon taxes are implemented or imagined. It too would price the externalities, and it's also viewed as fairly efficient compared to regulatory emissions. Got that right, Mike?
That's right.
So this is what the average of a lot of surveys, like about 24, 25 different surveys on each of these subjects looks like. About 75 to 80% of the American public supports capping carbon, letting the EPA impose a cap on carbon. The question's asked various ways. Sometimes the EPA is in the question, sometimes it's not. You're always in this range. Pretty popular. Regulated.
Is the actual level of the cap ever specified in those statements?
No, would it be meaningful? I don't know. I mean, they're just like, give them the power to do what needs to be done.
Should we be able to, I'm wondering if a survey respondent is thinking in their head, yes, we should be allowed to, we should be capping carbon at 10 times what it currently is.
Yeah. We'll see.
Is that a useful?
So cap and trade, like, similarly ambiguous question. You lose 30 points. Right? I'm sure if we put the amount in, I guess we'd still have a 30-point drop. It would just be the level would be lower. Carbon taxes, you lose 50 points. Depends on the level, but especially if you put out there a real carbon tax, like $1 a gallon, you're down in the 20% range. Only the real diehard people on this issue will go for such a carbon tax. And that's the level at which you start to think about this is going to make a difference in consumption patterns, which fuels we're using, and so forth.
If the carbon tax is revenue neutral, how does it stand?
It goes up in popularity, but you never get majority support.
But this is just a statement that people don't understand economics, right? I mean, 1 to 2 says make it more flexible, and people's support for it goes down, right?
Well, when I presented this, I've heard various arguments from different people. Like, maybe one of the problems is that these 2 types of regulation are too targeted on a specific problem, and when people think about this, they're thinking about a broader set of problems that could be solved. We'll see that in a second. So the question is, how are people thinking about these responses? I mean, in some ways, they think about economics perfectly, because the net present value for this society today, doing anything about carbon, is about, I don't know, 20, this is trivial. It's trivial. So we shouldn't be doing anything in net present value terms about this.
No, that's not true.
Yeah. We should be doing things about other things.
No. Every project should be assessed on one that's cost versus benefits.
Oh, we'll come back to that. So people want the inefficient policy. This drives Rob Stavins and my other colleagues in this domain nuts. And they've long written since, I think, the 80s about why do governments accept the inefficient policy? Why don't they accept the efficient policy, the one that we've derived? So there's one puzzle. Why are they going for the bad policy from the economics perspective? The other puzzle is, so what is explaining public opinion? And this is just a simple correlation between concern about global warming, how concerned are you about global warming, and support for a regulatory cap and trade, carbon tax. This is about 30%. So it's not a hugely strong correlation. And it's about the same for cap and trade and a little less for carbon taxes. So concern about global warming isn't differentiating these policies, and it's also not really driving them. This doesn't explain why 80% of people want a regulatory cap. So what does? What explains it? So went back to the regression model, went back to the experiments, threw a bunch of stuff in there. Said, okay, is it party? Is it ideology? Is it income? It turns out there's some interesting interactions. Concern about global warming interacts very strongly with income. If you're high income and concerned about global warming, you're actually willing to pay a lot. But if you're low income and concerned about global warming, you're willing to pay zero. If you're
These questions are asked in different surveys, right? Not one after the other.
Yeah, and multiple times. So I'm just showing you.
Yeah, but it's like if you say trade, then it triggers the thought about cost. If you just say should there be a cap, there's no trigger that makes people realize that actually costs anything, right? So it can be completely irrational like that. If the survey has no indication that there's any dollar sign involved, and people forget that there is.
But there are different wordings for these questions in different surveys. These correlations end up pretty similar. So I think there's just a general idea of do I like this policy or not like that policy, and it's a concern can correlate with what I care about and what I don't care about. And the cap and trade, and it's not called a regulatory cap in the surveys that we wrote. It's a description of exactly what it would do. Not called cap and trade, except as jargon, but then also described. And carbon taxes put in specific dollar terms, and these are put in comparable dollar terms. Is roughly what it would cost. So here's the interesting answer. These are our correlations, these lower bars, between the regulatory cap and global warming concern, the cap and trade and global warming concern, carbon tax and global warming concern. This is 0.3, so it's about 30%. This component is explaining about 30% of the explained variation. And then these are the size of the explained variation that's attributed to concern about environmental harms and prices associated with traditional fossil fuels, and environmental harms and prices associated with wind and solar. And the interesting thing that should jump out of the graph at you is these concerns are not as big here as here. People understand a link between energy and regulatory solutions that is not apparent to them in a big, meaningful way with cap and trade and carbon taxes. So this is Tom Steyer's insight about AB 32. So people got the link. People understood this is about energy. It's about energy prices. It's about, and most importantly, it's about harms. So the harms that people see associated with coal, oil, and natural gas and nuclear power are as big in explaining global warming policy as concern about global warming.
Now, have you ever heard that there's a rational explanation for all this, not just confusion, which I only learned by talking to environmentalists.
Wow, that's a good sentence.
The rational explanation is deep down they believe that when push comes to shove, the government would suspend the cap and or suspend the carbon tax or limit it, and that you would not actually get the environmental benefits that you're promising as in your survey question, and that the only thing they really believe is that, like kind of the way an engineer would see the problem,
if you put the regulatory cap or the required machinery on the plant, then you can be guaranteed that the stuff isn't going to come out of it.
Yeah. Also, maybe the regulatory cap is going to get you lots of co-benefits.
Right.
That pricing carbon is just going to target and incentivize technologies that only do that. Another explanation I've heard. We've asked follow-up questions, especially on carbon tax. Why don't you like this tax? And gets various responses. One of them is, I don't like taxes at all under any circumstances, period. Don't tax my fuels. Another is, don't tax me, tax the oil companies. So we get lots of different, there's not one single thing for people who are opposed to carbon taxes. The range of different rationales for why we should do it.
Did you ever get the federal government out of my Medicare?
Actually, no, but Mike Sandel and I had lunch one day and we had a bet, and I said, this was during this debate about whether or not people misperceive what's a federal program and what's not a federal program, and somewhere around 90% of people have had correct at that time that Medicare is in fact a federal program. So, and we compared Medicare and Blue Cross Blue Shield and FedEx and USPS and others and Federal Reserve and Bank of America, and people got the private entity and the public entity. There was not any confusion. They were concerned about something real, which is, yeah, there was regulatory change about Medicare in that bill, and people got scared because of the last couple of rounds of regulatory change on Medicare.
So you did surveys in Europe as well?
Yes, we'll come back to that.
It's the obvious question. Did you find the same thing?
Very similar. A lot more faith in regulatory solutions. Part of what's going on here, I think, is people just cap and trade is like, what is this? This sounds like a gimmick. And carbon taxes, we see similarly low levels of support for carbon taxes.
Even though they have huge carbon
Even
taxes.
though they want their carbon taxes reduced. They're at the limit. So a few implications. One big implication is if you're thinking about climate policy, concern about global warming is not enough to motivate the American public to act. It's not strongly enough correlated with preference about climate policy, and it's not at a high enough level yet. And we could wait a few years, but I don't think anyone wants to do that. We could wait for public opinion to catch up. But I think we saw something else that's maybe more important here, which is this other part of the whole discussion, which is how climate policy isn't climate policy, just as environmental policy isn't environmental policy in the United States. The environmental policy is our energy policy. And DOE is regulating nuclear power and waste storage from military sites and stuff like that. That's what they spend most of their energy on. They've got an R&D program. EPA has much more effect on energy in the United States, I think, than DOE. Don't cover me, I said that. But I think Ernie might agree. I know John agrees. And the important thing is people for EPA regulation understand that there's an immediate direct link between what the EPA is doing to cap carbon and to solve global warming problems and the energy sector. And they don't understand it for those other policy domains, such as carbon, cap and trade, or a carbon tax. So I think there's a different way to think about climate policy, or at least the discussion and debate that we have about climate policy in the United States and elsewhere, it turns out. And that is we have to see the linkages more clearly between climate and other concerns, such as soot, smog, mercury emissions. And I think Gina McCarthy and EPA know this, and they're pushing really hard, not just on the carbon emissions rules, but on all these rules. And this was the great insight from the paper that Mike and Adam Looney wrote, which is that if you take the cost-benefit analysis of the different things that each energy source produces, then coal loses most of its price advantage vis-a-vis wind if you price all the local environmental harms that coal produces, not the global ones. And once you've done that, you've gotten the policy challenge for how you find the extra $5 per ton, whatever the remaining amount is, down to a manageable level that you can sell to the American people. You can't sell a 25% surcharge on electricity. Maybe you can sell 6. You can sell a 5% surcharge. In fact, when we ask the question, how much would you be willing to pay on your electricity bill once a month if it solved global warming? The median person in the United States has $5, not more. So we're not going to get $25 from the majority, which would be getting into the ballpark that most of these regulatory regimes, such as the Kyoto Protocol, would imagine. We'll get $5. So the question is, how do we get the price of coal up high enough to make $5 a gettable thing from a cap and trade system or a carbon tax? And the answer, as Mike and Adam pointed out, is to go aggressively after health costs associated with coal and oil and natural gas and nuclear power. Second, we should stop thinking about climate policy as climate policy. We debated its environmental policy and its energy policy. We should view the climate implications of energy as part of the whole package, not as something in isolation. I think this is the critical mistake that the advocates of climate policy have made. Now, Warwick has been pretty good at putting this issue onto the national agenda, but also has had a bad effect on how we debate this and discuss this and think about it. It becomes just about climate, not about energy. We have to start with the inputs. And finally, environmental and energy policy, what the EPA is doing, are our climate policy. That's where our climate policy is. That's where it's going to be set. And we need to give higher priorities that simultaneously achieve immediate energy and environmental goals, as well as longer-term climate goals, such as raising the costs of coal through particulate, soot, mercury, wastewater regulation, ash regulation, and so forth. All right. Let's open it up for questions. Yeah?
Well, the thing about the gasoline, I mean, because the cost of per carbon molecules of a gallon of gasoline is so much higher than that for coal, you basically, there's no rational carbon tax that will affect gasoline at all, right? So it's not just because of how it's marketed, it's that there's no leverage on gas.
Yeah, there's not much leverage on gas until we get a good battery.
Can you be a little bit more specific about how the conversation should change? I mean, what's it going to take? What should the conversation? Give us some examples of what it should focus on to change people's perception.
Well, I think we should keep talking about climate problems to educate people to keep it out there, but we should stop pushing so hard on climate policy, especially cap and trade, as climate policy per se. We should think of cap and trade systems that solve broader environmental problems, such as soot and other emissions, not just carbon emissions, and then think about how this additionally benefits us in terms of carbon emissions.
So one of the assumptions you seem to make, and it's probably a rational one, is that people are willing to accept regulation on environment and energy, and your research demonstrated that they really weren't invested in regulation on global warming. Is that a given? Is that something that you've tested, that people say, yeah, regulation on energy, regulation on environment, it's important, we need to be doing? Because the idea is that the global warming policy is grabbing onto a horse that's already running.
Right, they accept giving EPA the power to cap carbon emissions.
If it's an energy policy, if it's an environmental policy, but if it's solely a global warming policy.
Well, if they support giving EPA the power to do that. The question is, how far are they willing to let EPA go? We don't know the answer to that question yet. But they support that at the 80% level, and that's similar to support for all sorts of EPA regulation in the environment. And they all seem to be kind of tightly packaged and correlated together. EPA's power, people view this as EPA's power to regulate the environment, and carbon is one of those things. So people accept that, but they're not willing to do the things that they would need to do at kind of a personal consumption level, such as pay a higher gas price, pay a higher electricity price, and so forth. And I think they just do not see the connection between cap and trade and energy.
And they're willing to accept the regulation on environment because they have the misperception that global warming might, or the carbon might be creating a local environmental problem for them, the smog issue. Well, for solving that, we're on board for that, but
Yeah.
Reducing carbon in the atmosphere so it's good for people in China or India, we're not so interested in that.
Yeah, so I've tested certain questions where we've asked about concern about other people in other places and concern about future generations. And there's pretty low concern about those things. They're correlated, but they're not as strong a driver as one might expect. So Americans tend to be pretty locally focused when it comes to energy regulation. And I think that the answer to the questions that we see a lot from Gallup and other sources, they're like, do you support EPA regulating carbon? I think people are thinking about that as EPA power to regulate the environment. Carbon is part of that. Yeah, I support that power.
And then I'll stop after this final follow-up. With all the people who live in coastal areas, is there a concern that a local environmental problem is sea level rise, or is that too far off in the future? They're interested in what's happening this week, today in my town.
I think when we get certain weather events and flooding events, that we're hearing more and more about this. There's some other interesting things going on, like weathermen have now banded together and are kind of using the weather, the nightly weather, to educate people about, here's the ice flows changing and things like that. And you see that. So that's part of public education about global warming. That's the sense of keep global warming present in people's minds, and different sectors of society are good at that. But I think we make a mistake when we just push on climate per se as the policy area.
Maybe this is a little simple, but if I'm interested in policy outcomes, not public opinion, is there any evidence to show that convincing the public will actually affect policy outcomes, except maybe for state legislature like California?
So there's a lot of public opinion research in the U.S. that tracks over long periods of time public attitudes, public moods, support for certain policies, and the adoption of policies. And public opinion tends to be the leader.
Really? Okay, so I know the one survey by Gillens and Page.
Stimson's Issue Evolution, books like that. So there's a long.
Okay.
Yeah.
The survey by Gillens and Page tracked 2,000 policy outcomes over the last 20 years and found that special and elite interests are what drove policy outcomes more than public.
Well, so there's a specification problem that's kind of complicated, like how do you pull those apart? And public and elite discussions, like this last slide that I showed you, drive the public discussion. So the elite, the usual way political scientists think about this is there's an elite discourse that's informing the public discourse. It's very rare that something comes purely out of the public into public discourse before an elite discourse, but it does occasionally occur. So more commonly in an area like this, where this is an elite discourse. Economists and climate scientists and so forth had this discourse for 30 years. So there's no doubt that elite discourse is driving this. And this need for consensus before we can go forward sensibly. And before that consensus existed, it was really hard to move the public discourse. Now we're starting to see the public discourse move. It's only in the 2000s that we're starting to see states really take action. Maybe the federal government. So it's definitely an elite discourse-driven area. So there's no dispute about that. But it's called the two-step flow of communication. There's elite discourse, it informs the public discourse, and that informs Congress, or the president, or the governor. Yeah.
You mentioned education and weather meteorologists. Does your survey reveal where people get their information about energy and energy costs and so on? What's the source? I asked this in light of all of the super PACs and stuff like that in the last few years, changing, war on coal and those sorts of things.
It's really hard to parse where people get their knowledge and information. There's been some one of my favorite studies is demonstrating that the Oprah Winfrey Show is a major source of information about war. The segment of the electorate that is watching daytime TV and they're not paying attention to news, but stuff seeps in through lots of common things that we're not even aware of. So I think our information sources are very diffuse. We kind of buy into this kind of notion that it comes from the New York Times, it comes from ABC and CBS and NBC and Fox and so forth. But in fact, we're getting our information from all sorts of diffuse locations, including friends and neighbors. And it's very hard for social scientists to figure out where it's actually coming from.
I guess I was going to ask for a philosophical discussion of this idea that we should emphasize local health effects in order to get people to buy into climate policy because they don't accept the real drivers of climate and they don't understand the economics. I start to get real uncomfortable with the whole level this is going because they're saying, well, those people don't understand, so we'll fool them by emphasizing some other thing in order to get the objective that we want, right? And you know, it starts to become, as a climate scientist, I start to get very uncomfortable with this presupposition almost that the ends justify the means and we're just going to emphasize these tangential effects or these things that aren't even climate because we're trying to sneak through a climate policy. I'm just not sure that really builds societal consensus in the way that's required to do something really expensive and really hard.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your thoughts about that?
So I'll turn it back to the economists, but my understanding from the economics profession as they're working on this is that the real benefit to people today for the whole portfolio of policies, not just climate policy, but anything in the energy and environment policy space, is getting rid of particulates, getting rid of, and the societal benefits are enormous, and they swamp the present value benefits of doing something about climate today. Now, there's there are all the moral and philosophical questions about what the consequence would be. But then there's this other complicated thing to think about, which is, okay, if we take the total societal benefits accumulated over hundreds of years of all those particulates, how much worse is society for ignoring that problem compared to ignoring this problem? And I don't know if anybody's done that calculation yet, but today's calculation is these problems, smog and so forth, are much bigger in terms of our immediate health benefits. And if we do believe that there's this public opinion-driven policy response, that Congress follows public opinion, and there's a lot of evidence actually that they do, then they're going to follow what people are concerned about now. Asthma attacks, pulmonary disease, stuff like that. State regulators do that. They're going to respond to smog in the Central Valley. They're going to respond to ash waste dumps overspilling from coal treatment plants and things like that, asbestos in rivers. That's what they'll respond to. So in terms of what politically we're going to respond to, those are the things that are going to happen that will galvanize public opinion and will galvanize the legislature. And if we want to be smart about taking a political strategy that also helps us solve this other problem, it's to don't focus too much on that other problem at the expense of this problem that people really care about. If we talk about something that people don't care about, they don't listen.
I know.
Yeah, and that's where we are.
It starts to get into the territory of we're fooling you, right? A little bit,
No, it's
you can easily go that direction.
You could, and you never underestimate the Machiavellian orientation of political scientists. And that's kind of the opportunity. It's like, oh, Bush should have taken that opportunity when he did the State of the Union to restructure the tax code and got it the way he wanted it. And he missed an opportunity. It's like, that's because that's the way my head works. I'm just saying there are two benefits. And if we just push on this one, we're not going to get anywhere. And that's what the public discourse is kind of about. But if we say that there's this big benefit over here, and it's linked to this, or it can be linked to this one, let's link them and push on this because we're going to get that benefit along the way. Or we're going to get closer to that objective. Go ahead. No.
One of the more interesting things you said among the many interesting things you said was, and you just said it in passing, related to what you were just talking about. You said something about if we focused on mercury, we'd make more progress on global warming than focusing on global warming. Is that related to the health of mercury? And is there a technological link between reducing mercury and reducing carbon? Or is it just reducing any is good for all? And how's it relate a little bit just to lead? We've had such success in getting lead out of gasoline and impacting the well-being of fetuses and young children with that lead gone. That was regulatory, but it wasn't price. Is there a lesson there for this?
Yeah, so the coal study in 2003 went into exactly this question. It was